What happened to Jasmine Brooks on that cold February night in 2007? A 16-year-old girl, walking home from her school's basketball game, just like she had 1,000 times before. But this time, something was different. This time, she vanished without a trace. No one could have predicted what would happen next. The night was supposed to be like any other, but for Jasmine, and for everyone who loved her, it would mark the beginning of a nightmare. Jasmine Brooks, an honor student, a basketball player, someone with so much promise, disappeared as she walked a route she had walked every single day. No warnings. No signs. Just gone. For more than a decade, the question haunted Trenton, New Jersey. What happened to Jasmine? The search for answers was relentless. The police, the family, the community. They all searched, and yet the answers remained elusive. But in 2019, after 12 long years, something incredible happened. A breakthrough. A twist that would finally shed light on the mystery. What had remained unsolved for so long would soon be revealed. Missed opportunities. Cold leads. One crucial mistake. Technology. And an unlikely twist of fate. This isn't just another cold case. This is a story of persistence. A story of a family's unyielding hope. A story of justice that was a long time coming. But why did it take so long for the truth to come to light? Why did the case go unsolved for 12 years? Jasmine's mother, Patricia Brooks, spent those years not only grieving, but fighting. Fighting for her daughter's story to be heard. Fighting for justice. She fought against time, against the painful silence that grew louder with each passing year. And now, the truth. It was finally within reach. Stay with me as we take you through the twists, the heartbreak, and the shocking revelations that led to the final unraveling of Jasmine Brooks' story. Before I begin, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. I'd love to know just how far this story is reaching. As the days passed and the search for Jasmine intensified, the case seemed to slow. The police had combed through the area. They had interviewed witnesses, searched every corner of Trenton. But despite all their efforts, nothing substantial came to light. Detective Maria Gonzalez was tasked with leading the investigation. She was a seasoned officer, calm under pressure, experienced in solving cases. But even she couldn't help but feel the weight of this one. Jasmine's disappearance felt different. It was as if the city itself had lost a piece of its soul. But no matter how hard they tried, the case grew colder with each passing day. Jasmine's friends, her teammates, everyone was desperate to find answers. The community rallied around her family, creating search parties that scoured the parks, the alleys, even the abandoned buildings. People plastered flyers on every telephone pole, hoping someone, anyone, might have seen something. And yet, nothing. Every lead fizzled out. Every tip turned into a dead end. For weeks, the search continued, but slowly, people started to lose hope. The local news moved on to other stories, leaving Jasmine's case behind. But not Patricia. Jasmine's mother, Patricia Brooks, wasn't going to let her daughter's name fade into the background. Not without a fight. Patricia became an advocate for justice. She organized vigils every year, lighting candles in Jasmine's memory and urging anyone who might have seen something to come forward. She didn't stop, not even when the detectives' calls grew less frequent. She knew something was off. Jasmine wouldn't have just vanished. She had always been so careful. This wasn't like her. Patricia knew her daughter. Something was wrong. But as the years went by, the investigation slowed to a crawl. The community's interest began to wane. People had their own lives to get back to. The case grew stagnant, cold, forgotten by many, but not by Patricia. Through the years, she did everything she could to keep Jasmine's case alive. She spoke to anyone who would listen. Police officers, reporters, even strangers. She started a campaign that pushed for a new look at the case. She went to city council meetings, demanding that the investigation continue. She wouldn't let them bury her daughter's memory. Yet, with every year that passed, the chance of finding Jasmine seemed to slip further out of reach. But what if the case hadn't died? What if, for all those years, it had been waiting for the right moment? The right technology. In 2019, Patricia would learn something that would change everything. A small glimmer of hope would emerge from the very thing that had once seemed to hold the investigation back: DNA. And this is where the story truly begins to shift. Because after 12 years, a breakthrough was finally on the horizon. The case had always been cold, yes, but it hadn't been unsolvable. It had been waiting for the advancements in forensic technology to catch up. Imagine this. For more than a decade, investigators had looked over the same evidence, over and over. But something had been missing. A critical piece, a tool that could reveal the truth. The very thing that could bring Jasmine's killer to justice. But that tool had only just become available. As DNA technology advanced, and genetic genealogy became the new frontier, the impossible suddenly seemed within reach. Detective Maria Gonzalez had long since closed the case files, but the DNA from Jasmine's torn jacket, collected all those years ago, was about to be analyzed again. And this time, the results would bring a shocking revelation. What if the killer had been close by all this time, hiding in plain sight? But who could it be? What would it take to finally solve Jasmine's case? For Patricia, the fear was starting to come true. The mystery of her daughter's disappearance, though buried under layers of time and failed investigations, was still there, waiting to be solved. And as the DNA results would soon reveal, the breakthrough they'd been waiting for had arrived. But the question remained, would it be enough to bring justice for Jasmine? As the case broke open, secrets long buried would surface, and the community, shocked, heartbroken, would have to face the truth that had been hidden from them for so long. What happens next? Who will be uncovered by the new DNA evidence? And how will it all connect to Jasmine's disappearance? Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the chilling truth behind this case. Before I continue, I want to take a moment to thank all my amazing subscribers for supporting this channel and helping it grow. These stories take a lot of time, effort, and research to produce, and I couldn't do it without your support. If you've been moved by this story, like this video, hit that subscribe button, and stay with us for more incredible cold case investigations. Share this video with someone who still believes justice can be found, even in the darkest of mysteries. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell, so you'll be the first to know whenever I drop another powerful video. Your support really helps keep these stories alive. Thank you. Jasmine Brooks was more than just a 16-year-old girl. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and lit it up with her presence. Honor student, talented basketball player, and someone who had big dreams. She wasn't just another teenager. She was destined for greatness. Her future was already laid out before her. College basketball scholarships, a promising career, a life filled with promise and potential. The kind of life most teenagers only dreamed about. She had a smile that could brighten the darkest of days, and an infectious laugh that made everyone around her feel at ease. On the basketball court, Jasmine was a star. Her teammates relied on her, her coach counted on her, and her community was proud of her. She was everything you'd want your daughter to be, a role model, a student, and a young woman with everything to look forward to. But then, that night, February 14th, 2007, a night that should have been like any other. Jasmine finished her basketball game with a victory, just as she'd done so many times before. The excitement of the game still ran through her veins as she walked out of the gym, her coat pulled tight against the cold, her basketball bag slung over her shoulder. Her route was simple, familiar. She had walked it 1,000 times before, and it was no different that night. Except it wasn't long after Jasmine stepped outside that her footsteps faded into the night she would never return from. For Jasmine's mother, Patricia, it was the longest night of her life. As the hours ticked by and the minutes stretched on, Patricia felt an increasing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. By 10 p.m., Patricia was pacing the house. She stared at the clock, eyes darting back to the door. The spaghetti sauce was cold now, but it didn't matter. Jasmine wasn't home. She made the call to the school. No answer. The basketball coach's voicemail was full. Patricia's heart raced faster with every unanswered call. She called the police, but they reassured her, as they often did, that there was nothing to worry about. She's probably out with her friends, maybe lost track of time. Kids do that. But Patricia knew better. Jasmine wasn't just any teenager. She was responsible. She was reliable. This wasn't like her. And the more Patricia thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just a case of a teenager out late. No, something had happened to Jasmine. With the sound of her daughter's empty room echoing in her heart, Patricia started to feel the coldness of an unthinkable fear. She didn't stop calling. She didn't stop searching. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each one worse than the last. What could have happened to her baby? As the hours wore on, the night slipped into the next day. And with it came an unmistakable dread that settled deep in Patricia's chest. Detective Maria Gonzalez, one of Trenton's most seasoned investigators, was the one assigned to Jasmine's case. She had seen missing persons cases before. She knew the drill. But this one felt different. Gonzalez knew that in cases like these, the clock was already ticking. But there was nothing to indicate a clear cause of disappearance. No ransom note. No strange phone calls. No evidence of a struggle. She started with interviews. Patricia was the first to speak. Her eyes were swollen, her voice trembling. The desperation in her words was undeniable. She knew something was wrong, and she was begging for someone to listen. Then there was Jasmine's friends. They, too, couldn't understand why she hadn't shown up at home. Jasmine had always been the one who kept track of time, the one who reminded everyone else to stay safe. Her teammates recalled how, during the game, Jasmine was her usual self, focused, energetic, and brimming with potential. There was nothing that stood out about that night. The same could be said for her coach, who said Jasmine always stayed after games to talk strategy, her sharp mind soaking in the coach's every word. But that night, nothing was the same. Despite all the interviews, all the searching, the case seemed to stall. Patricia's hope dwindled with each passing hour. Gonzalez knew the struggle all too well, the exhaustion that comes with chasing dead leads. The whole community felt the weight of the mystery, a dark cloud hanging over Trenton. As days turned into weeks, the case hit a brick wall. And slowly, the world around Jasmine's family started to forget. The search parties scattered. The news outlets moved on to the next tragedy. Time marched on, indifferent to the pain of a mother who still believed, still knew, her daughter wasn't gone forever. But for Patricia, it wasn't over. The darkness of not knowing ate away at her. And so, she continued to search. Year after year, she kept Jasmine's name alive in the hearts and minds of those who would listen. She organized vigils. She spoke at town meetings. She plastered flyers all over Trenton. It didn't matter that others had long moved on. Jasmine's story was not forgotten. Not by Patricia. And then, 12 years after her daughter vanished, a breakthrough. It wasn't the break anyone had expected. Not a new witness. Not a new tip. It wasn't even a lead. It was DNA. Forensic technology had advanced in the years since Jasmine's case went cold. The cold case team knew the evidence they had, the jacket Jasmine had worn that night, had been preserved. But what could they do with it now? Could it lead them to the person responsible? Detective Gonzalez, now working with cutting-edge DNA technology, sent the evidence off for reanalysis. This wasn't just about new technology. This was about new hope. Would this new round of testing bring clarity? No one knew, but they were willing to try. As the DNA results came in, everything started to change. A chilling thought began to form in the back of Patricia's mind. What if the person responsible had been hiding in plain sight all this time? It wasn't just a question. It was the answer Patricia had long feared. The question, though, remained. Could this breakthrough be the key to finally finding out who did this to her daughter? The breakthrough was close. The answer was just within reach. But was it enough to bring the justice that Jasmine deserved? And who would be revealed by this new DNA evidence? As the case began to pick up speed, the first whispers of a name surfaced. A name that had been buried beneath the years of false leads and unyielding silence. A name that seemed almost too ordinary. Michael James Foster. A maintenance worker with no criminal record. Or so it seemed. But that was only part of the story. The truth. Far darker. Foster had lived in the shadows for years, unnoticed by the majority of those who came in and out of Trenton. He was the quiet worker, the one who blended into the background, the kind of person no one suspected of anything. But what they didn't know was that for years, Michael James Foster had been hiding something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. It started subtly: questions about school schedules, inquiries about after-school activities, seemingly innocent interactions with young women. He worked the evening shifts as a maintenance worker in public buildings, cleaning gyms and hallways, servicing offices and classrooms. His job gave him access to places others would never think to look. But it was in those moments, under the cover of mundane tasks, that Foster had learned the routines of the very students and faculty he worked alongside. Foster's interest in the comings and goings of young girls had never raised suspicion. It was common for maintenance staff to be around at odd hours. But with time, something darker began to emerge. For years, Foster had harbored a pattern, a disturbing and insidious pattern of stalking. The women he had targeted were often just beginning their journeys into adulthood. Teens. Young, impressionable girls. He had been careful, almost methodical, in selecting them. He'd study their movements, know their schedules, and learn everything about their lives. His eyes watched from the shadows, his presence unnoticed until it was too late. But in February of 2007, something shifted. Foster had gone too far. And Jasmine Brooks had been his victim. That night, while Jasmine walked home from her game, Foster was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect opportunity. And when she walked alone, he seized it. Yet, in the original investigation, Foster's name hadn't even made the list of suspects. He was just a maintenance worker, a harmless man in a sea of others. And so, when he was briefly questioned early on, the investigators saw nothing suspicious. They checked his alibi, spoke to his co-workers, and dismissed him. No evidence, no foul play, nothing to suggest his involvement. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much darker story. In 2019, Detective Sarah Thompson and her team decided to reopen the case, bringing fresh eyes to evidence that had been long overlooked. That's when the key piece of evidence, Foster's DNA, was rediscovered. Foster had long since passed away in 2017, his quiet existence ending with little fanfare. But during his final arrest, unrelated to Jasmine's case, a DNA sample had been collected. That sample, posthumously added to the National DNA Database, became the breakthrough investigators needed. It didn't take long for the results to come back. Foster's DNA was a match. A match for the evidence found on Jasmine's jacket. A match for a crime that had gone unsolved for over a decade. And just like that, everything started to fall into place. The investigation picked up steam. Detective Thompson and her team revisited Foster's property, retracing the steps they had missed years before. And what they uncovered shocked everyone involved in the case. Buried beneath the dirt and debris of his yard, hidden away like forgotten memories, was evidence that connected Foster directly to Jasmine. Personal items. Items that were far too personal, far too intimate. Among them, Jasmine's vintage brooch. A brooch she had been wearing the night she vanished. The very brooch that had never been seen again until now. It was almost as if Foster had left a breadcrumb trail for detectives to find. A deliberate gesture. Or maybe, just maybe, It was a cruel reminder of what he had done. The brooch was the key. It was the proof they needed. The final, irrefutable evidence that Foster had been involved in Jasmine's disappearance. As the team pieced everything together, a haunting realization started to take shape. Foster had been right under their noses all along. He had been questioned, interviewed, and dismissed, merely a footnote in an investigation that had already begun to slip into the cold case files. But now that oversight seemed glaring. How could they have missed it? How could they have overlooked a man who had been living in plain sight? A man who had known everything about Jasmine's routine, who had studied her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The more they dug into Foster's background, the more unsettling things became. He wasn't just a random figure in the background. He was a predator. A serial predator who had been stalking young women for years. And Jasmine had been his victim. But she wasn't the only one. Foster's past was riddled with disturbing incidents, each one a missed opportunity for justice. He had been involved in several cases of harassment, but never enough evidence was collected to take him down. The question lingered, what if someone had acted sooner? What if his pattern had been stopped before Jasmine? The deeper Thompson and her team went, the more they uncovered. Foster had never been a registered sex offender. He didn't have the obvious signs of a criminal mastermind. But that was the danger, wasn't it? He blended in. He was just another face in the crowd. He was the quiet, seemingly harmless man working late shifts. Now, Detective Thompson found herself confronting a stark truth. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. And the more they discovered about Foster's violent history, the more chilling it became. Foster was dead, yes. But his actions, his shadow, still loomed large over this investigation. He had managed to elude justice for years. And now, finally, thanks to modern forensic science, he was going to pay for his crimes. As the team prepared to confront the full scope of Foster's actions, the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. This was about all the other young women he had victimized. The women whose lives he had quietly ruined. Foster had been hiding in plain sight, but now the truth was coming to light. The damage had been done, but at least, at long last, justice was finally within reach. But the question remained, how much more was there to uncover? How many other victims had been left in the wake of Foster's sickening pattern? And what would happen next when the community learned the full extent of his horrifying crimes? Do you believe the police could have caught Foster earlier if they had looked at things differently? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And, by the way, where are you watching from? I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. I read and reply to every comment, so don't hesitate to share your opinions on what you think could have changed the outcome of this investigation. As the investigation into Michael Foster deepened, so did the toll it took on the Brooks family. Patricia Brooks, Jasmine's mother, had become more than just a grieving parent. She had transformed into an advocate, someone who would not let the case die. In the years following Jasmine's disappearance, Patricia had spent countless nights staring at the old empty chair at the kitchen table where her daughter used to sit. The dinners that were meant to be shared never came. Jasmine's spot remained empty, and every quiet evening only amplified the weight of the missing. Patricia was a woman who had once known joy, who had known what it felt like to hold her daughter in her arms and dream of her bright future. But after February 14, 2007, those dreams became fragments, scattered, lost in the void of unanswered questions and deep sorrow. Her grief grew into something almost unrecognizable. Her obsession with justice pushed her to extremes. She wasn't just mourning anymore. She was fighting for a truth that had evaded her for so long. Every year, on the anniversary of Jasmine's disappearance, Patricia organized vigils in Catalanda Park, where Jasmine's body was found. The community came out, sometimes in small numbers, sometimes in large crowds, but Patricia was always there. Every candle lit was a symbol of hope, but more than that, it was a reminder of a mother's unwavering fight for answers. Patricia's voice trembled as she spoke at those vigils, speaking about justice, about the importance of holding on to the fight, even when the world seemed to forget Jasmine. "We won't stop until we get justice," she would say. "We won't let anyone forget what happened to my daughter." Her words weren't just for the crowd. They were for herself. Her way of holding on to the belief that Jasmine had not vanished into the night without a trace. Patricia knew that without the case staying in the public eye, without the relentless pressure from the community, the investigation might lose steam, and Jasmine might become just another forgotten name on a cold case list. But Patricia wasn't alone in this fight. Enter Ben Brooks, Jasmine's older brother. For years, Ben had been the silent figure in the background of his mother's grief-stricken battle. But after his mother's emotional breakdown and her separation from her second husband, Ben became something more. Something that Patricia had always hoped for but feared she'd never see. Ben began to step up. Ben's emotional struggle was just as profound as his mother's. But where Patricia's grief turned into an unstoppable force of advocacy, Ben's grief took a different form. He became determined, almost obsessive in his own way. Ben needed to understand what had happened to Jasmine, not just for himself, but for his mother. His search for answers became personal. He began revisiting old leads, old evidence, anything he could get his hands on. Ben didn't have the same resources as Detective Gonzalez or the state police. He didn't have the forensic team, the DNA analysis, or the years of experience. But he had something no one else had, the unwavering heart of a brother. The heart of someone who would stop at nothing to find the truth. While his mother fought for justice in public forums, Ben fought behind the scenes, quietly pushing through any doors that might lead to the breakthrough they so desperately needed. Every phone call he made, every letter he sent, brought them one step closer. The search for Jasmine was now a family affair, a mission that extended far beyond the boundaries of grief. Ben's tireless effort was now entwined with Patricia's advocacy. Together, they were determined to keep the case alive, to find the missing pieces of the puzzle, even if those pieces had been hidden for years. Meanwhile, in the investigative world, things were moving at a different pace. The cold case, which had remained dormant for over a decade, was about to reignite. The DNA reanalysis of Jasmine's clothing, which had been preserved meticulously by Detective Gonzalez, was the first step. The technological advancements in DNA analysis had come a long way, especially in the field of mitochondrial DNA sequencing and genetic genealogy. Fast-paced shifts were in the air, and things started to happen quickly now. Detective Sarah Thompson, now the lead on the case, had requested a reanalysis of the DNA samples that had been previously collected. She knew that the previous DNA results had yielded partial markers, not enough to identify a suspect at the time. But now, in 2019, the advancements in technology allowed for the amplification of even the most degraded samples. In March 2019, Dr. Rachel Martinez, a forensic scientist at the New Jersey State Police Forensic Laboratory, informed Detective Thompson of the breakthrough they had all been waiting for. Jasmine's DNA had been tested again using the most current techniques, and this time, the results were enough to make a match. That was when the unimaginable happened. The DNA led them to Michael James Foster. At first, the name meant nothing to anyone. But as Thompson dug deeper into Foster's history, the details began to paint a grim picture. He had been a maintenance worker at Trenton Central High School, the very school Jasmine attended. His presence at the school during after-school hours, his access to the building, and his suspicious behavior were all pieces of a disturbing puzzle that had been ignored in 2007. What shocked everyone was that Foster had already died in 2017. But when his DNA was collected during an arrest for an unrelated charge, it was entered into the Cody's database, which was the game-changer for this case. Foster's DNA was now linked to the crime, even though he had passed away. The discovery was chilling. The police had already questioned Foster back in 2007 but dismissed him because they lacked evidence. But now, Foster's posthumous DNA would provide the crucial link. It was like a cold slap to the face, a twist no one had expected. A decade of false leads, blind alleys, and missed opportunities had led them back to Michael James Foster. And to make matters worse, Foster's history of harassment and stalking young women had gone unnoticed. It wasn't just Jasmine. He had been watching other girls too, silently building up a pattern of predatory behavior. Now, everything started to fall into place. Detectives went back to Foster's property and began searching again. This time, the breakthrough came in the form of a vintage brooch, Jasmine's brooch, found buried under Foster's yard. This item, which had been missing for 12 years, confirmed what they had all been hoping. Foster was the one. But as the evidence mounted, a new question arose. If Foster had been questioned and dismissed in 2007, could this case have been solved much earlier? What had caused the investigators to overlook him in the first place? And what else might be uncovered about Michael Foster's hidden past? With every new discovery, the weight of Jasmine's tragic fate became clearer. But just as the case was about to reach its conclusion, the investigation uncovered another shocking layer. What was waiting in the shadows, still buried, still waiting to be uncovered? And what would happen when the community learned the full extent of Foster's crimes? As the years passed, the investigation into Jasmine Brooks's disappearance seemed to be slipping further away from the public eye. But for Ben Brooks, Jasmine's older brother, the search for answers never stopped. In the years since his mother, Patricia Brooks, had started her relentless fight for justice, Ben had often stood in the shadows, watching as she poured every ounce of her being into her advocacy. But after Patricia's emotional breakdown and the unraveling of her marriage, Ben stepped into the void. Ben had grown up in the shadow of Jasmine's disappearance, never knowing what it was like to live without that lingering weight of uncertainty. The quiet absence of his sister had haunted his every step, and in a way it had defined much of his life. But now Ben could no longer sit idly by. After years of watching his mother fight for justice, he realized that if the truth was ever going to be found, he would have to take matters into his own hands. Ben's quiet resolve grew, and he became an active part of the investigation, digging through old files, making phone calls, and following any lead he could find. Every day, every minute, every phone call was a step closer to answers. He couldn't afford to lose hope, not now. Not when his mother was too exhausted to continue. In late 2019, Ben met with Detective Gonzalez, the woman who had first handled Jasmine's case. The meeting was emotional. Ben was now a man with his own family, a life that had unfolded in ways his sister would never experience. But even as he sat across from Detective Gonzalez, Ben was a man on a mission to learn the truth for himself and for his mother, who had spent over a decade in the shadows of grief. Detective Gonzalez had been the one to break the news to Patricia that Jasmine's case was being reopened. But it was Ben who was the driving force behind the final unraveling of the case. It wasn't just about closure anymore. It was about getting justice for his sister and ensuring that her name was remembered, that her killer would never go free. Ben said, "It's strange, you know, how long it took for us to get here. All these years I had no idea who did it, and now when I see his face, it's just too much to take in. How could someone live so many years without anyone knowing who they were, without them getting caught?" Ben's words were filled with disbelief. His frustration was palpable, knowing that the person responsible for his sister's death had been out there for over a decade. Foster had been a shadow in the background, just another face in a crowd, until technology caught up to him. Ben's journey wasn't just about finding out who did it. It was about facing the reality of how the world had moved on while he and his mother were left behind, haunted by what happened that cold February night. In the midst of all this, the investigation had been gaining momentum. The reanalysis of DNA samples had yielded an unexpected breakthrough. Detective Gonzalez had been closely monitoring the progress of the investigation, staying updated on every new development. As the DNA samples from Jasmine's jacket were sent to the forensic laboratory, the results began to trickle in, one step at a time. At first, the findings were inconclusive. The markers were there, but they weren't enough to definitively identify the perpetrator. But that all changed when DNA genealogical matching came into play. By 2019, advances in genetic genealogy had become a powerful tool for solving cold cases. What had once been a handful of fragmented DNA markers from 2007 was now a treasure trove of information. The forensic team could compare the genetic material with thousands of profiles in genealogy databases, linking familial connections and eventually identifying potential suspects, even if they had never been in the system before. It was this breakthrough that finally connected Michael James Foster to the crime. His DNA had been collected posthumously, after he was arrested for an unrelated charge, and entered into the Cody's database. When the match came through, the pieces fell into place. The man who had gotten away with murder for years, who had been questioned in 2007 but dismissed due to a lack of evidence, was now the prime suspect. But while the investigators were finding crucial breakthroughs, the Brooks family continued to hold on to a thin thread of hope. For Ben, the information felt surreal. Finally, the truth was within reach. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, there was no closure. There was still the matter of how Foster's DNA could have been collected and analyzed earlier, but the fact remained: justice was coming, even if it took 12 years. Detective Gonzalez said, "Sometimes the most important thing is to not give up." The case was cold for so long, but it didn't mean we stopped looking. And when that match came through, when we saw Michael Foster's name pop up, it felt like all the pieces finally fit. I can't explain what it felt like for me as an investigator, but for Ben and his mother, this was the moment they had waited for. As the investigation continued, the full scope of Foster's crimes began to unfold. But one thing became clear: he had been living among them, blending into the community, unnoticed for years. Foster had been working as a maintenance man, someone who had access to schools, who knew the routines of students, and who had stalked young women for years without anyone knowing his true nature. But the most chilling discovery came when investigators uncovered a hidden stash of photos of young girls. Not just Jasmine, but several others who had been followed or harassed by a man matching Foster's description. This was a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long, and now, with Foster's DNA finally linked to the crime, the investigation was about to come to a head. The discovery of the vintage brooch, Jasmine's brooch, was the final, irrefutable link. But as the pieces came together, the lingering question remained: why had Foster been dismissed in 2007? Why had he been allowed to slip through the cracks of the initial investigation? As the truth began to unfold, one thing was certain: this was not just a story of justice delayed, but also of the price of overlooked details, and how new technology had been the only thing to finally uncover the secrets hidden in plain sight. The next chapter was about to be written, and it was going to be a chapter that would forever change the lives of the Brooks family. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, a new layer of mystery was uncovered. Detective Maria Gonzalez had been in the game for a long time, but even the most experienced eyes can miss the smallest of details, the ones that could change everything. It was late one night, after another long day of re-examining old files, that Gonzalez found herself sifting through dusty records in a part of the courthouse that few had visited in years. The case files had been pushed to the back of a storage room, nearly forgotten by the department. But something about Jasmine's case nagged at Gonzalez. There had to be more. She knew the evidence had been preserved meticulously, but it felt like there was something they had missed. And that night, as she scanned the old yellowed papers, something caught her eye: a file that seemed out of place. It wasn't the case file she'd been assigned. It was a folder with no label. A folder that didn't belong to the investigation. It was buried under piles of unrelated cases and seemingly untouched. But inside that seemingly insignificant file lay the missing link, a crucial piece of evidence that had been completely overlooked. Gonzalez could feel her pulse quicken as she opened the folder. Inside was a collection of old interview notes, crime scene photos, and witness statements. The file contained statements from a witness that had never been fully processed. Someone had seen Michael James Foster near Jasmine School on the night of her disappearance. But what was most astonishing was the fact that Foster had been questioned in 2007, just days after Jasmine's disappearance. He had been interviewed briefly, but somehow the interview notes had been misfiled under the wrong category, marked as a civil matter instead of a criminal one. The crucial details were buried in plain sight, ignored by investigators at the time. The file had slipped through the cracks, never to be revisited, and it almost cost the case everything. Gonzalez froze as she pieced it together. How could they have missed this? The very person who had been the key to solving the case had been questioned early on, yet he was never seriously investigated again. The mistake was one that had haunted the investigation, like a shadow always just out of reach, and yet it was hidden in plain sight. The file revealed a brief statement from Foster himself during his interview in 2007. At the time, he was only considered a person of interest, a maintenance worker who had been seen around the school. He had provided a false alibi, saying he had been elsewhere, but nothing about his story stood out at the time. The department had a lot of leads to follow, and Foster's name, though raised, was eventually discarded. What Gonzalez now realized was that Foster's identity had been hiding in plain sight all along, right there in the very files they had. He had been questioned, dismissed, and then buried in the case's history, never truly pursued. His connection to Jasmine's disappearance was right there in front of them, all along. Detective Gonzalez's voiceover said, "When I saw that misfiled case, it was like a punch to the gut. How could we have missed this? Foster's name, his alibi, everything was right there, but we didn't see it." Gonzalez's heart pounded in her chest. It was all starting to make sense. Foster's initial dismissal, his false alibi, his lack of any real scrutiny, had allowed him to escape justice for years. He had been so close to being caught in 2007, yet a simple clerical error had set the investigation back by over a decade. The question echoed in Gonzalez's mind. What if they had gotten it right the first time? What if Foster had been investigated thoroughly when they had the chance, instead of being dismissed as just another maintenance worker? If the investigation had been thorough, Jasmine Brooks's family might have received closure much sooner, and Foster might never have been allowed to walk free. Instead, he had evaded justice, hiding behind the mistakes of a broken system. The mistake had nearly cost them everything. And now the question remained, how close had they come to solving the case in 2007? Foster was already on the radar. They had questioned him, but his story was weak. A simple mistake, a misfiled piece of paperwork, had allowed him to slip through their fingers. The investigation had faltered, and Foster's name never came up again in connection with Jasmine's disappearance. But that was all changing now. The breakthrough DNA evidence had linked him to Jasmine. The genetic genealogy analysis had provided undeniable proof. The truth was finally coming to light, and the case that had been buried for 12 years was now closer than ever to being solved. The path forward was clear now. Foster's identity had been uncovered, and with the new DNA technology, the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. But the question still loomed large. How had this investigation gone wrong in the first place? And more importantly, what had been lost because of it? The emotional weight of the case was growing heavier, especially for Patricia Brooks, Jasmine's mother. She had spent over a decade holding on to the hope that one day, someone would come forward with the truth. Now that truth was finally being uncovered, and as she heard the news, the weight of everything came crashing down on her. But just as the investigation was gaining momentum, another shocking twist came to light. What if Foster wasn't working alone? What if there were others out there, waiting for the right moment to strike? As the case progressed, the unsettling possibility loomed. Was Foster just the tip of the iceberg? And what other secrets was he hiding? The investigation was about to reach its most dangerous chapter yet, but the answers were finally within reach. The emotional weight of the case wasn't just felt by the detectives or the community. It had carved deep scars into the lives of those closest to Jasmine. Patricia Brooks, Jasmine's mother, was at the heart of this pain. For over 12 years, she had carried the heavy burden of not knowing what happened to her daughter, of not knowing if Jasmine was still out there, alive or worse, dead. Patricia's grief wasn't just something she carried. It consumed her, transformed her. Her home was filled with reminders of a life that would never return. Jasmine's room remained untouched, just as she had left it. Patricia couldn't bear to move her things, as if the smallest change would erase the presence of her daughter. Her pain became a public affair, with vigils, interviews, and constant campaigns for justice that kept her daughter's name alive. But behind the advocacy, behind the signs and the speeches, was a woman broken by the absence of her child. Her obsession with the case wasn't just a mother's love, it was her soul's desperate plea to bring her daughter back. And it cost her everything. Her marriage crumbled under the weight of her relentless search. She pushed away friends and family, isolated in her grief. Patricia's relationship with her second husband deteriorated as he grew frustrated with her inability to let go of the past. He didn't understand that Patricia couldn't stop searching, couldn't stop believing that somehow the truth would be revealed. The sleepless nights, the endless phone calls, the yearly vigils, it all became too much for her marriage to withstand. She became consumed by the search. Every year, every hour, every minute felt like another step further from the woman she used to be, and closer to the person she was becoming, a mother desperate for justice at any cost. And then, in stark contrast to Patricia's grief, there was Michael James Foster. Foster's psychology was complex, dark, chilling, and disturbingly methodical. He was not the face of an obvious predator. Foster's appearance was unremarkable. A middle-aged maintenance worker, graying hair, weathered skin from years of manual labor. Nothing about him screamed danger. He blended into the background, living a life that seemed ordinary enough, and that was his power. But there was something inside him, a darkness that grew over time, festering in the corners of his mind. Foster didn't just stalk, he studied. His obsession with young girls wasn't random, it was calculated. It wasn't about one moment of violence, it was about control, the thrill of knowing their patterns, knowing exactly when they'd be alone, where they'd go, and how to intercept them. Foster had been to school after school, year after year. He wasn't just working. He was watching, collecting information about teenage girls who spent time after hours in schools, in gyms, in libraries. He was always there, waiting for the right opportunity. A predator cloaked in normality, pretending to be just another part of the background. As the investigation into his life unfolded, detectives uncovered a pattern, a disturbing history of stalking, harassment, and unreported incidents. His pattern had been so consistent, so methodical, that it seemed like a rehearsed script. Young girls, alone, vulnerable, were the prey he had spent years studying. And now, here was the horrifying truth. Jasmine Brooks had been the victim of a man who had carefully planned this moment. She had been a part of the many routines Foster had learned, a moment waiting to be seized. But what made it worse was that, in 2007, when detectives initially questioned him, his subtle behavior had slipped through the cracks. They hadn't yet recognized the predator hidden behind the normal facade. For Ben Brooks, Jasmine's younger brother, the toll was different but just as profound. Ben was only a teenager when his sister disappeared. He had been there, growing up alongside her, sharing memories and hopes for the future. But in the absence of his sister, Ben's world had been cast into shadow. His childhood was marred by the trauma of not knowing. He was forced to witness his mother's transformation into someone consumed by grief. Ben couldn't just sit back. He had to seek answers. Answers for his mother, for his family, and for his own peace of mind. But it was no easy task. The grief that Patricia had carried for 12 years now became Ben's burden. His journey was not just one of seeking justice for his sister. It was a painful process of finally confronting his own trauma. His transformation from a victim of grief to a seeker of justice was slow and painful. But every step, every interview with detectives, every file he reviewed, brought him closer to the truth about his sister, and the darkness that had enveloped their family for so long. As the investigation into Michael James Foster gained momentum, so did the emotional toll on those who had been touched by this case. For Patricia, it had become more than just a fight for answers. It was a fight for dignity, for the memory of her daughter, who had been robbed of the future she deserved. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, there was a lingering question that no one could avoid. What if Foster had been stopped earlier? What if he had been thoroughly investigated in 2007? Would Jasmine still be alive today? But even with all these revelations, there was still one haunting truth. Foster may have been the face of this crime, but what if he wasn't the only one? Could there have been others lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike? The twisted web of abuse and predation was about to be uncovered. But was this just the beginning? Could more victims have been waiting for their own answers? Answers that had been hidden for far too long? The investigation into Michael Foster was far from over. As the investigation unfolded, Ben Brooks found himself standing at a crossroads. The weight of the past, the questions, the unanswered pleas for justice, had shaped the man he was becoming. The search for Jasmine, the little sister he could never forget, was now his burden to bear. The ghost of her disappearance hung over him, just as it had over his mother, Patricia. But for Ben, the pain was different. Ben wasn't just looking for answers. He was trying to understand the grief that had consumed his mother, the grief that had taken hold of their family and torn it apart. As Patricia relentlessly fought for justice, Ben watched his mother transform from a nurturing, hopeful figure into someone almost unrecognizable, a woman so deeply entrenched in sorrow that every victory she earned in the search for Jasmine felt like a small piece of solace amidst an ocean of pain. Ben had spent years wrestling with his own sense of helplessness, not only because of his sister's disappearance but because of how his mother had changed. Her relentless pursuit of justice, her refusal to let Jasmine's name fade from public memory, had been both her strength and her undoing. Ben felt this weight, and in many ways, he was forced to inherit his mother's search for justice. What kept Ben going wasn't just his desire for answers, it was his unspoken need to protect his family. The grief his mother bore became his grief too, and he realized he had to help her find peace. His journey through this relentless search mirrored his mother's. He began his own investigation, tracking down leads, poring over old files, and refusing to give up on the one thing his mother had held onto for over a decade: the belief that someone had to know the truth. It wasn't just about solving a case for Ben. It was about healing, about helping his family finally close this painful chapter. But, like his mother before him, Ben would soon come to understand that the search for justice would come at a great personal cost. Each day spent closer to the truth brought with it an increasingly heavy emotional toll. As Ben dug deeper into the investigation, he found himself haunted by the same questions that had tormented his mother. What had happened to Jasmine? Who was responsible? But now, Ben's pursuit of answers wasn't just about reliving the pain. He was determined to end the story. No longer just a child lost in the grief of his sister's absence, Ben had become the key figure in uncovering the truth. And just as Ben's personal journey unfolded, Detective Maria Gonzalez found herself reflecting on the case that had so thoroughly consumed her. Her own commitment to this case had been more than professional. It had become personal. Gonzalez, having seen countless cases in her years of service, found herself moved by the sheer perseverance of the Brooks family. As a detective, she had experienced the heartbreak of cold cases. Cases that slipped through the cracks, buried under years of bureaucracy and unfulfilled leads. But Jasmine's case, with its years of dead ends and false starts, had tested Gonzalez in ways she didn't expect. Watching Patricia continue to advocate for her daughter, organizing vigils, speaking with anyone who would listen, tirelessly pushing for justice, was a constant reminder of the unwavering love of a mother and the devastating cost of not knowing. For Gonzalez, this case had evolved into something more than an investigation. It had become a symbol of hope, showing her that sometimes justice didn't happen right away, but it didn't mean it wouldn't come. But now, as Ben and Detective Gonzalez met, the emotional weight of their combined efforts culminated in a pivotal moment. The files, the DNA samples, the interviews, all the work they had put in, had led to a breakthrough. Finally, the pieces of the puzzle that had been out of reach for so long were now within grasp. Ben's eyes reflected a mix of anticipation and dread as he sat across from Detective Gonzalez. The moment they had both waited for was now in sight. But what awaited them wouldn't be an easy victory. And that moment arrived with the revelation that changed everything. The case, which had once seemed cold and distant, was suddenly alive with possibilities. Ben and Gonzalez now held the key, the final piece of the puzzle that would bring justice to Jasmine and her family. Detective Gonzalez had kept the faith throughout this process, believing in the evidence, in the technology, and in the relentless spirit of a mother's love. But now, as the DNA results came back, they confirmed what they had feared and hoped for. The arrest was inevitable, and the answer was finally within their reach. But even as the final breakthrough came into view, there was still the lingering question. How had this all been possible? How had this monster hidden in plain sight for so long? The answers, the ones they had spent years searching for, were finally within their grasp. Yet, as the truth emerged, it wasn't just about justice for Jasmine anymore. It was about a fight for the lives and peace of the people she left behind, a search that had tested the endurance of her family. What happens when the truth finally comes to light? But the cost of that truth is far greater than anyone could have imagined. I want to pause here and thank every one of my incredible subscribers for helping this channel grow. These true crime stories are not easy to produce. They take countless hours of research, dedication, and a deep commitment to sharing the truth. If this story touched you, like this video, subscribe, and be part of this journey with us. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Someone who still believes that even the coldest of cases can be solved with persistence. And if you haven't already, turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss when I upload another shocking story. Your support means everything, and it keeps us going strong.